Good evening, everyone, and welcome to UBC Okanagan's Nobel Night 2021. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Silks Okanagan Nation and their peoples, whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of these lands. My name is Leslie Cormack, and I'm honored to serve as the Deputy Vice Chancellor and Principal of UBC's Okanagan campus. Thank you for joining us, and welcome as we come together for our 9th annual Nobel Prize event and our second virtual event in as many years. Nobel Night at UBC Okanagan began back in 2013 as an opportunity to engage the community on the meaning and relevance of Nobel Prize winning achievements. The Nobel Prizes have come to be regarded as among the world's most prestigious awards. They're matters of national pride for the recipients, and they serve as conduits for public exposure to science, scholarship, and other great achievements. But why a Nobel Night at UBC Okanagan? Why hold this event when the prizes weren't awarded to UBCO or any of tonight's faculty presenters? At least not yet. Universities have been considered ivory towers, perceived as remote and in a world of our own. Likewise, research and scholarship is too often clouded in obscurity for the average citizen, with unknown relevance to everyday life. But now, thanks to engagement opportunities like this one, and ever greater information at our fingertips, these perceptions are changing. Nobel Night builds connections between UBC and the community with meaningful dialogue that provides a window into the exciting world of research and scholarship. It's a chance for you to hear from local experts engaged in the very same type of pursuits as the Nobel awardees, be it as chemists, medical experts, cultural scholars, economists, or journalists, on the achievements now known to one and all, thanks to the Nobel Prizes. But while we're making great strides in making information more accessible than ever before, barriers still exist within our institutions that have perpetuated ongoing bias and systemic racism, limiting opportunities and recognition for many deserving scientists and scholars. This is a widespread issue in academia, and one that UBC is working tirelessly to address at our own university. From convening open and honest conversations about science and systemic racism, to promoting gender diversity in STEM, supporting pathways to success for Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and honoring our truth and reconciliation commitments. We're setting the course for a better future and taking action today to make it happen. Indeed, the world has changed in many ways since the inception of the Nobel Prizes. As we honor this year's Nobel laureates and recognize their outstanding contributions, we also want to think critically about the biases that continue to influence major academic and research awards to this day. The Nobel Prize began as a bequest by Alfred Nobel to reward those whose work conferred, as he said, the greatest benefit on mankind. He may have done so, in fact, in response to the criticism that his fortune came from death and destruction as the inventor of dynamite. Over the years, the Nobel Prizes have rewarded particular types of scientists, increasingly those who work in large, well-funded teams. This has meant that scientists from less rich countries or women who often work in smaller teams or alone are often less likely to receive this prize. So there are definitely changes that are needed to the prizes and how they are awarded. And yet, those who have and are now receiving the awards have done groundbreaking and discipline-changing work. So honoring them tonight makes sense, even as we really must argue for positive changes throughout academia in future Nobel laureates. Now, before I pass the virtual mic to Jen Jacoby, your MC for this evening, I would like to call on UBC Okanagan's Provost and Vice President Academic, Ananya Reid, to join me on screen and to turn on her camera. As we celebrate excellence and innovation this evening, it seems a fitting opportunity to share a few words of thanks to a remarkable colleague, educator, and leader. As many of you are already aware, Dr. Reid was recently appointed Vice Chancellor of India's Shiv Nadar University and will be leaving UBC Okanagan at the end of January. Ananya Mukherjee-Reid first joined UBC in 2018, leading many exciting and innovative changes at our university during her time here. In the face of many challenges in the past few years, Ananya has led our campus with unwavering resolve and commitment to UBC's academic mission and its students. Her dedication to excellence in teaching, learning, and research, as well as her passion for creating impactful student experiences, is nothing short of remarkable and deeply inspiring to those who have the privilege to work with her. Her tireless work to further inclusion, respect, and uplift underrepresented voices has had lasting impacts that will be felt deeply and by many across the country, and indeed around the world for generations to come. She truly leaves UBC better for her presence. Her leadership, wisdom, and passion have transformed our campus. I can think of no greater way to honor her than by continuing her important work. Ananya, on behalf of the entire UBC community, thank you so much for your incredible dedication. And I wish you all the best in your new role at Shiv Nadar University. You will be greatly missed. I'd now like to invite Ananya to share a few words.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for those very, very kind and humbling words. I'm deeply humbled by all the things that you said. If you're wondering about the Zoom background that I have today, it was a photo I took from my first flight from Vancouver to Kelowna. Little did I know that that trip was going to become such a big part of my life. As Leslie just said, I am embarking on a new adventure next year. Thank you for all the kind words you have sent my way. They have literally moved me to tears. I'm sure we will continue to work together and create exciting new partnerships, which will be valuable to all of us. There is one question I want to leave you with. Who would you have given the Nobel Prize to if it were up to you? For me, this year, the prize would go to the public, the millions of ordinary people who speak and have spoken truth to power, even amidst the infinite adversities they endure. In this, I include all those doctors and frontline health workers who spoke up for the well-being of their patients, the scientists, educators, journalists, students who speak against the devaluation of science, the everyday citizens who speak for indigenous justice, for racial justice, and for climate justice. The strength of these voices challenge every day the unjust connections between knowledge and power. My prize this year would go to all of them. And if possible, I would love to hear who your prizes would go to. And with that, let me turn it back to Leslie to get on with the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ananya. You've really challenged us to sit through tonight's presentations and really pause and think about how we would make decisions for these amazing awards. It's now my pleasure to introduce your MC for this evening, Dr. Jen Jacoby. Dr. Jacoby is a professor with the School of Health and Exercise Science at UBC Okanagan, and was recently named the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada Chair for Women in Science and Engineering program for the British Columbia Yukon region. Take it away, Jen.
Thank you, Leslie, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of our entire university, I welcome you, virtually of course, to UBC Okanagan's 9th Annual Nobel Night. Thank you for joining our celebration of great thinkers and groundbreaking ideas. Tonight, we aim to increase our understanding of the contributions made by this year's Nobel laureates and what these discoveries mean in our everyday life. The Nobel Prize award ceremonies take place at Oslo City Hall in Norway tomorrow, December 10th, the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. For 2021, the Peace Prize laureates will receive their awards in person at the Oslo ceremony, and all other laureates will receive their prizes in their home countries. Each award consists of a Nobel Prize diploma, and each is unique in every way, a unique work of art and calligraphy. A Nobel Prize medal, each handmade in 18-karat recycled gold. Wow. And they also receive a document confirming the prize amount. Now, in 2021, it's set at a Swedish krona of 10 million per full Nobel Prize. That's about 1.5 million Canadian dollars for each Nobel Prize. That's a lot. Now, before we learn more about this year's awards, let me tell you a little bit more about Alfred Nobel and the Nobel Prizes. Alfred Nobel was a Swedish businessman, chemist, engineer, and inventor. That's a lot. He was an extraordinary scientist, and by the time of his death in 1896, get ready for this, he held 355 different patents. His most famous invention being dynamite. He went on to become a leader in the manufacture of cannons and other armaments, and as a result, became very wealthy. What persuaded the dynamite king, sorry, couldn't help it, to devote his fortune to charity? Well, when he was 55 years old, Nobel's brother Ludwig died. And in a case of mistaken identity, Alfred was pronounced dead with the newspaper headline, "The Merchant of Death is dead." Well, rumor has it that after this incorrect reporting, Alfred rewrote his will to leave the majority of his fortune to a series of prizes. This, the Nobel Prizes, his lasting legacy. So now we know a little bit about the history. How about learning how the Nobel laureates are selected? It's very simple. It starts with a nomination. Scholars in a wide variety of fields, including previous winners, are able to nominate individuals using an online form. It's come a long way since 1901. A short list is then created, and these candidates are extensively reviewed in a process that takes up to 8 months. That's a lot longer than most grant reviews in academia. Now, if you've heard of any nominees rumored to be in the running, I would encourage you to don't pay any attention to that. The Nobel Foundation is bound by secrecy, and the annual list of those nominated is kept secret for 50 years. The winners are selected through a majority vote by the Nobel Committee, and then they receive the famous phone call. I suspect now it's cell phone, and they're informed that they have received one of the most prestigious awards in the world. Now tonight, we are very fortunate to have 4 distinguished UBC researchers and a local CBC Radio One host, Chris Walker. Some of you who regularly tune in can probably already hear his voice, who will help us decipher the discoveries and the achievements of the 2021 Nobel laureates. Now, summaries for each one of these laureates have been prepared. They're going to last about 8 minutes long that we're going to share. And we're going to cover the fields of chemistry, physiology or medicine, peace, literature, and economics. Now, following the presentations, our audience will be invited to ask questions as per part of the Q&A. Now, you can ask a question at any time by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please indicate when you create your question whom you're directing your question to. And you can see the presenters' names in the bottom of each of your videos. And the other thing to keep in mind, if you're not positioning a question, you can actually like other people's questions. And the more questions, the more that a question becomes liked, the higher it comes in our priority list for asking. So don't be afraid to find the most important questions with your thumbs up in that little button as well. Now, we're going to do our best. We can't promise answering all questions, but we will do our best to get to them all following the presentations. So with that, let's begin with chemistry. The first presentation tonight is by Dr. Stephen Mcneill. Stephen is an associate professor of chemistry within the Irving K. Barber Faculty of Science. Dr. Mcneill will be speaking about the Nobel Prize, of course, in chemistry. It was awarded jointly to Benjamin List and David W.C. Macmillan for the development of asymmetric organonucleotides. And to really decipher this words, as well as the chemistry award, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Mcneill. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Jen. So, chemists, they're mostly like other scientists. We do the same kind of stuff. We observe the physical world, we run experiments, we write stuff down, we figure out what's going on. Chemists operate exclusively at the scale of atoms and molecules, and that's a little weird because we can never observe those things directly. They're far too small, but we figured out how to deal with that problem. And we do that for the same reason that other scientists do what they do. We're curious. That's weird. Why did that happen? I bet you I can figure that out. But chemists do something that other scientists don't really do. Chemists don't leave the physical world the way that we found it. Chemists make new stuff. We create brand new materials out of brand new molecules that didn't exist before we made them. And we don't do that because we're curious. We do that because of bloody-minded hubris. I bet you I can make that molecule. Oh, I bet I can make it faster. We're really good at this. We take all the stuff that we have and we transform it at the molecular scale into all the stuff that we need. And we can do this because we have an exquisite understanding of how the atoms combine via bonds to form molecules with particular shapes and how those shapes lead to the properties of the materials that we want. So here's one example. These two molecules look pretty similar, and they are almost identical. They have the same number and type of atoms connected by the same bonds and the same arrangement. They have identical physical and chemical properties, and we call them by the same name. These are both proline, but they're not identical objects. These two molecules are mirror images of one another, and there's nothing I can do to make them exactly the same. You'll note that there are some oxygen atoms, the red atoms, that are pointed into the center, and some are pointing left and some are pointing right. Well, I can fix that. I can grab a hold of those oxygen atoms and spin them around. But if you look carefully, some of these oxygen atoms are pointed back toward me and the others are pointed out toward you. And so they're not, well, I could fix that. I could spin it around this way. But now the blue atom, the nitrogen atom, it's in the wrong place. There's nothing that I can do to make these two molecules exactly the same. And the word that chemists use to describe this is chirality. It's derived from a Greek word for hand because your hands have this property. They're mirror images, but you can't superimpose them. There's nothing you can do with your hands to make them identical objects. And ordinarily, we wouldn't care about this because these molecules have identical chemical and physical properties, except that this molecule proline, it's an amino acid. And if you make a long chain of amino acids, you get a protein. And if that protein does some chemistry in your body, it's called an enzyme. And they are all made exclusively out of this mirror image of amino acids and never that one. Here's a picture of a protein. This protein is called HMG-CoA reductase, and it's an enzyme in your body that is used to carry out a step that makes cholesterol. If we zoom in on this, there's a little molecule parked inside it. This molecule is called atorvastatin or Lipitor. I take 60 milligrams of this every day so that my cholesterol doesn't go through the roof and I don't die. But we have to make sure that I'm taking this form of Lipitor and not this form. You want to know if your molecule is one mirror image and not the other? The easiest way to do that is to interact it with another mirror image molecule. Take your right-handed glove and see if you can fit your left hand into it, and you'll know immediately that that doesn't fit right. If I take the wrong mirror image of Lipitor, it won't fit into my enzyme and it won't work properly. So that's a really important concept that we need to take care of, and we need to know we're making the right molecule. How do we do that? Well, we have that technology. We've had that for quite some time. 20 years ago, Knowles, Norrie, and Sharpless got a Nobel Prize in chemistry for figuring out how to use little metal mirror image molecules to make other mirror image molecules. Here's an example where a rhodium catalyst is being used to synthesize the drug L-Dopa. But these metals, rhodium, they're in a part of the periodic table that's really hard to get, and it's really expensive, and they're mostly kind of toxic. Here's what's been going on with the price of rhodium recently. About 5 years ago, it was only $650 an ounce. It cracked $30,000 an ounce earlier this year. If you know somebody who's had the catalytic converter stolen out of their car, that's the reason why. But if you're relying on this metal to make your life-saving drug, that's a very serious problem. What if we didn't need to do it that way? What if we could create little mirror image molecules that could synthesize the other mirror image molecules without the metals, organic compounds making other organic compounds? Well, if you could do that, well, that would be a lot cheaper, and that would be a lot greener, and that would be far more sustainable, and that would be less toxic. And if you could do that, well, you'd win a Nobel Prize, except that it's too late for you to do it. These guys already did it. Ben List and David Mcneill won the Nobel Prize this year for developing organic compounds that can do this catalytic chemistry and synthesize just one mirror image and never the other mirror image. These are the chemical reactions that they first published to do this about 20 years ago, almost at the same time in the Journal of the American Chemical Society. List used a little chiral compound. Hey, it's proline. That's the same proline molecule. Macmillan used something different. He made this imidazolidanone complex to run his chemistry, but they do sort of the same idea. There's a nitrogen atom in that little compound that reaches out and grabs a hold of one molecule and directs and controls the reactivity that it takes place to form the product that we want. Here's sort of a close-up of how the List catalyst works. Proline is reacted with one compound to make this enamine intermediate. And what I need to do here is to react it with a second molecule and form a new carbon-carbon bond between these two atoms. You want to make big organic compounds out of little organic compounds? New carbon-carbon bonds, that's the ball game. That's what you need to control. Now, I can do that from this side, and I'll form a carbon-carbon bond to get this mirror image. But that's not the one I want. I want this other molecule to come in from the other side, and I'll get this mirror image molecule. That's the desired product. And you remember those oxygen atoms that were on one side of the molecule or the other? Well, they actually reach out and grab a hold of this new molecule that's coming in and make sure that that molecule forms the bond only from this side to make only this hand, not from the other side to make the other one. And in this way, the chiral catalyst controls the bond formation to form exactly the mirror image that we want and not the one that we don't. This has completely transformed how synthetic chemists do this kind of work. 5 years after those first papers, there was a book published that was full of examples of this. It was almost 500 pages. 8 years after that, another book, 600 pages. Just earlier this year, a third book just on this topic, another 500 pages. If you've got access to the UBC library, you can read these first two books online. They're free. We're probably going to be getting the third one pretty soon. What this means is that this is a completely new way to make these kinds of compounds. It's the third pillar of asymmetric catalysis. Used to be there were only two ways to do this. You needed an enzyme or you needed a really expensive metal compound. And now you don't. You can do as a little organic compound to make your other organic compounds. I can't show you a specific example of an industrial or pharmaceutical process that makes use of this technology because private industry tends to be a little secretive about the tech that they're using. But there have been hundreds and hundreds of patents in the literature that have been published using this kind of thing. And so that means it's a really good bet that you or somebody you love is being kept alive by a drug that is made using asymmetric organic catalysis. And that is why your 2021 chemistry Nobel laureates are Benjamin List and David Mcneill. That's my time. I'm going to turn things back over to our MC, Dr. Jen Jacoby, and she will introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Stephen. If I only knew years ago that I could learn chemistry with a leather glove, I would be in a very different spot. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to move on to this year's Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, awarded jointly to Dr. David Julius and Ardem Padapute for their discoveries of receptors for temperature and touch. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shaygun Oyaday, who's an associate professor of teaching in the Department of Cellular and Physiological Sciences within the Faculty of Medicine. And he's here tonight to tell us more about this prize. Over to you.
Thank you, Jen, and good evening. The 2021 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded jointly to Dr. David Julius of the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, and Dr. Ardem Padapute of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Scripps Research, Loyola, California. These two scientists won the Nobel for their discoveries of receptors for temperature and touch. My presentation this evening is an attempt to describe their life work in 8 minutes, a clearly impossible task. So what I'd rather do is to focus on why their discovery matters and why it is particularly useful in the treatment of pain. So here's where I do a little bit of a shameless plug to tell you of the work that my colleague, Dr. Claudia Krebs, shown here, and myself have done. We produced a YouTube video with the help of our talented filmmaker, Zach Rothman, and his crew from the Faculty of Medicine. And this video presents an explanation of the science and the humanity of pain. So please have a look at this, at that link when you get a chance. But I'd like to go on to the work of Dr. Julius. And he won the Nobel for his contribution to our understanding and potentially finding solutions for pain. Together with his team, they discovered a protein on the surface of nociceptors. So nociceptors are nerves that detect pain. And Dr. Julius discovered the actual mechanism that these nerves use to detect pain. They are how we know, for example, that we have stepped on a pin or touched a hot stove or slammed our finger in a car door or in a mouse trap. These proteins are the way we sense those millions of times when we go, ouch, and these proteins are called receptors. So Dr. Julius named these gatekeepers for pain TPRV1 receptor, the one that he discovered. And remember that these receptors respond to heat and pain. Like I said, when we absent-mindedly place our hand on a hot stove. So it turns out that these receptors are also the ones that are turned on when we eat chili. And the chemical in chili that these receptors are particularly sensitive to is called capsaicin. Now, these TPRV1 receptors open just like a gate or a door would open. A sliding door would open when heat, in response to heat, or like I said, in response to capsaicin. Now, this opened up the possibility that if we were able to block these TPRV1 receptors, we would be able to help people who suffer from pain. So my next graphic here is an attempt to illustrate the potential impact of Dr. Julius's discovery that these TPRV1 channels, they are on the surface of nociceptors, those nerves that respond to pain, as well as they also respond to capsaicin and other chemicals that are released when the body is injured. Now, these channels open, like you can see here. Initially, they're closed, but when capsaicin or these other chemicals are introduced, they open. And when they open, they let in this, what is represented by these tiny white dots. These are sodium ions. And these sodium ions then activate a signal that go all the way, first of all, to the spinal cord and then to the brain. And then the brain perceives that as something hot or something painful. And we experience all of that. And however, there's a unique problem that occurs in patients that suffer chronic pain. When the pain is ongoing and is chronic, such as in arthritis, for example, what happens is that these channels undergo what we call sensitization, meaning that smaller and smaller signals are able to open these channels. And so these patients feel pain all the time. And but the hope is that now that Dr. Julius and his colleagues have discovered these gateways, these receptors that open to these signals, if we're able to block them, if we're able to block those channels, we will be able to help patients who suffer from chronic pain. So this segues nicely into the work of Dr. Pataputian. He was fascinated by the human sense of touch. So together with the researchers in his lab, they identified another protein channel also found on nerves that are called mechanosensory receptors. These channels open not to chemical signals like capsaicin, but to touch or pressure. Pataputian called these channels that he discovered piezo 1 and 2. the next graphic shows how they work. And what happens is that whenever mechanical forces like touch or pressure come near these receptors, they open and also let in ions or these small chemicals like sodium, which also then go to signal to the spinal cord and to the brain that somebody has touched us or that we are feeling pressure in one part of our body. Dr. Pataputian went on to show that these channels, these ion channels, are the principal sensors for all kinds of sensations apart from touch, including the sense of proprioception. Proprioception is how we know where our body or the parts of our body lie in space without looking. All right. So I can ask you, for example, now to close your eyes. If I ask you, close your eyes and touch your nose. All right. You can do that effortlessly without looking. That is the sense of proprioception. And Dr. Pataputian discovered the nerves and the channels that enable us to be able to do that. These channels are also found in all sorts of things. They're also, for example, important in a particular type of pain called allodynia. Allodynia is a particular type of pain that is unrelenting and that becomes so sensitive that even a sense of touch, like putting on a shirt, all right, for patients, for example, who've had shingles in the past, when they put on a shirt or their clothes, it's so painful. These channels that Dr. Pataputian discovered are also responsible for that. They play another part in interoception. That's how our bodies control our blood pressure in everyday situations. Like when we get up from a sitting position, unknown to us, our blood pressure tends to fall, but our interoceptors, they're called baroreceptors, they respond and immediately put up our blood pressure to counteract that effect. The channels that Dr. Pataputian discovered are also responsible for that. So here's a more scientific graphic that shows all the different parts of our body where these channels are important. And there's so many, too numerous for me to mention now. So it's the way the two Nobel laureates' work converge is that their work show us that we are able, hopefully, in a not too distant future, to develop a cure or at least some medicine or medication that would help to control pain. And that is why their work is so important, and we offer them our congratulations. I hand back to Jen. Thank you.
Wow, Shaygun, you covered pain in 8 minutes. That's impressive. Thank you. Now, we're going to move on to the Nobel Peace Prize. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the challenges that many individuals overcome to succeed and be recognized in their field as we introduce this prize. In the beginning, Dr. Cormack drew highlight to some of these challenges. I'd like to consider one of these groups specifically as it relates to one of this year's awardees, women. Since 1901, of the 975 laureates, there are only 58 women, 0.05%. Now that number might seem short or grim, and if we were to only speak from the lens of 0.05%, it would also seem to be a deficiency, because what we're failing to recognize is the change. That 50% of that 0.05% of awardees were in the last 20 years. Now it might be slow, but there really is positive and recognizable change happening in academia and happening at the level of the highest awardees, the Nobel laureates. So let's not lose sight of the small things that are becoming big elements of change, positive change, as we're moving forward. Now with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our invited guest from CBC Radio's One, Current Affair Morning Show. He needs no introduction. You can probably hear his voice in your head from Daybreak South, Chris Walker. Tonight, Mr. Walker will speak on the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize, which has been awarded jointly to Maria Resna and Dmytro Andreevich Muratov for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, thank you, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walker.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm honored and humbled tonight to speak on behalf of my profession at a time when my profession, frankly, is under siege around the world and here at home. I'm slated to speak for 8 minutes tonight. In my business, 8 minutes is an absolute eternity. In your business, 8 minutes is a footnote. This year's Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, as you mentioned, to two journalists, Maria Reza from the Philippines and Dmitry Muratov from Russia. More on both of them in a moment. Now, with the possible exception of the prize for literature, the Nobel Peace Prize is the most subjective and is therefore the most political of the Nobel Prizes. The two prizes, literature and peace, share something this year because, as Ezra Pound said, literature is news that stays news. Now, Ezra Pound was, among other things, both a fascist and a psychopath. And I don't know, I mean, it's possible those themes may come up again in my presentation tonight. More on these gentlemen in due course. Here is this year's World Press Freedom Index from Journalists Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières. The darker the color, the less press freedom. The Nobel Committee, in awarding this year's prize, reminded us that freedom of expression is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. And there are brave journalists working all over this map. You'll notice the black areas, China and the Middle East, most notable among them. No question, this prize could have easily been awarded to people writing about the end of democracy in Hong Kong, reporters covering political prisoners in Egypt, or one of the rare independent journalists still working in Bashar al-Assad's Syria. But the consensus among journalists is that with this prize going to these two specific people, one in the Philippines, one in Russia, is that the Nobel Committee has launched a warning flare for the rest of us, those of us living in the red, the orange, and the yellow areas on this map. And I draw here on the writing of Anne Applebaum, and it's reinforced by my own experience over the last 5 years of my 20-year career. Now, Anne Applebaum is a classic liberal, far more conservative than today's liberal vanguard would prefer, far more liberal than today's conservatives can bear. She's the author of a book called The Twilight of Democracy, and she makes an important point here about the roots of autocracy today. Because what binds autocrats today is not really what I joked about earlier. I mean, it's not really fascism and psychopathy, or any political ideology or pathology for that matter. Applebaum made the point last month in a piece in The Atlantic called "The Bad Guys Are Winning." And the bad guys, she says, call themselves communists, nationalists, and theocrats. No one country leads this group. What really bonds the members of this club is a common desire to preserve and enhance their personal power and wealth. Unlike military or political alliances from other times and other places, the members of this group don't operate like a bloc, but rather like an agglomeration of companies. Call it, she said, autocracy incorporated. And this is what modern journalism is up against. You see it in obvious repression, the brazen murder of Jamal Khashoggi on American soil, the arrest of publisher Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, Donald Trump egging on furious crowds to turn on reporters at campaign rallies. Yes, you see it in the detention of journalists on Wet'suwet'en territory here in Canada too. And you see it in the mean tweets on my Twitter feed. I'm a very local and not very famous public radio host in a small Canadian city. And yeah, sure, whining about my Twitter feed might trivialize what journalists in other places endure. But just today, I spent hours in meetings with CBC management, security experts, and police because someone threatened to ambush our staff, drag us out of our studio, and burn it down. And so the point is this: would-be autocrats have plenty of fans and followers, and those fans and followers are throwing their weight around just now. And as long as the state is still a democracy, it's annoying and funny, like my Twitter feed. But when that state tilts toward autocracy, these online threats suddenly seem a lot more menacing. Take Russia, where Dmitry Muratov, a former cub reporter for Pravda in the Soviet Union, started Novaya Gazeta in 1993, when Russian democracy still seemed possible, even probable. For almost 30 years, his newspaper has been the only press outlet consistently critical of the government in Russia, and that has become increasingly dangerous, of course, under the consolidated power of Vladimir Putin. Muratov joked darkly this week that he only got the Nobel Peace Prize because he was the only prominent journalist still alive in Russia. 5 of his paper's journalists have been assassinated. 21 journalists in all murdered since Putin came to power, 1 for every year of his reign. Muratov will dedicate his prize tomorrow to those dead colleagues. But he also sees the greater context, the global autocratic context I mentioned earlier. He spoke about it yesterday to Time magazine. He said, "I do see a tendency that's pretty frightening. The era when Václav Havel could come out on his balcony and see 300,000 people gathered, that era is over. 30 years ago, we were all enamored with democracy. Today, it seems to me that many people are enamored with dictatorship. In that sense, the context has changed a great deal." Now, Maria Reza works in a very different place, but much of Muratov's experience will be familiar to her. She too started her career for the official state newspaper. She too has been critical of the anti-democratic bent of her country's president. She too labeled an enemy of the people and a foreign collaborator. Maria Reza rose to prominence as a producer and writer for CNN in the Philippines during the reign of Joseph Estrada, and then started her own online publication during the rise of the much more dangerous Rodrigo Duterte. In an interview, she got him to admit to personally killing 3 people, and she has investigated his government's corruption and assassinations and online troll armies for years. Throughout, she's also been a public intellectual. She's a fellow at the Initiative on Digital Economy at MIT. She's a 2021 fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She also teaches at her alma mater, Princeton University. For the past 10 years, she and her colleagues have been harassed, fined, subpoenaed, and jailed. She now faces jail time under the Philippines' cyber libel law, which was written specifically to prosecute her. In 2012, she published a story about a judge getting a bribe. Shortly afterwards, the government passed this new law. In 2014, an editor with Rappler, that's her newspaper, went online and corrected a spelling mistake in that article about the judge. Well, the government considered that republication, and so Reza was arrested and, of course, convicted. She now faces up to 6 years in prison. The director for the Center of Investigative Journalism at Columbia University argued that the conviction is representative of how democracy dies in the 21st century. Here's what she said upon winning the Nobel Prize. Listen to how similar this is to Muratov and to Anne Applebaum. "This prize was an acknowledgement globally for all journalists of how difficult it has been to do our jobs, to hold power to account. The last time a journalist was given the Nobel Prize was in 1936, and he languished in a Nazi concentration camp. The Nobel Committee looked at the world, and I think they're saying we're at the precipice of something like 1936. And on that uplifting note, my 8 minutes is up.
Thank you, Chris. Whether it be for your thoughts tonight, your voice in the morning, your accurate but quick-witted tweets, we appreciate your impact and your thoughts in this small city we call Kelowna. Now, before I go on to introduce the next speaker, I do want to offer a reminder that we will have a Q&A session at the end. It's going to follow all of the presentations. And just to remind everyone with us, you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen in your Zoom window. And you can not only ask questions, but you can vote for questions. And the more you vote on a question, the higher it goes up in our like screen, and then the greater likelihood it will be asked. So with that said, please place your questions, and we're going to move on to the next prize, the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, Dr. Jennifer Gustar is an associate professor of English and Culture Studies with the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies here at UBC Okanagan. Tonight, she'll speak about the 2021 Prize in Literature. It was awarded to the novelist Abdulrazak Gurnah for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugees in the Gulf between cultures and continents. Please welcome Dr. Gustar.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce the Nobel Laureate in Literature, Abdulrazak Gurnah. And this is him yesterday receiving his prize in London. Abdulrazak Gurnah was given the Nobel Laureate in Literature for 2021 because, as Jen said, it was for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the Gulf between cultures and continents. Afterlives on the left is his most recent novel, which was published in 2020. He was born in Zanzibar, Tanzania in 1948. He is only the 6th African to receive the award in its 120-year history. He migrated as a religious refugee to England at 18 years of age with his brother and completed his PhD at the University of Kent on the literature of West Africa, and became a highly regarded scholar and professor of post-colonial literature at Kent. I had written quite a different slideshow for you a couple of days ago, and then I heard Abdulrazak Gurnah give his Nobel speech, and I was so moved that I felt I needed to share some of it with you. And he says, in England, in homesickness and amidst the anguish of the stranger's life, there emerged something I needed to say, a task to be done. A new, simpler history was being constructed, transforming and even obliterating what had happened during the German occupation. It became necessary to make an effort to preserve that memory, to write about what was there. There was also another understanding of history that was necessary to address, one that became clearer to me when I lived closer to its source in England. In England, I gained a better understanding of how someone like me figured in some of their stories of themselves. A desire grew to write in refusal of the last of the self-assured summaries of people who despised and belittled us. And these two directions into the simpler history that is emerging with the effacement of the truer history of the German occupation, and also the story of the refugee, are the two things that he is most engaged in writing about. So I would say, coming down to it, his work deals with migration, memory, and relations and relationships. Again, the erasure of history and the sense of non-belonging and longing for a sense of home. also the effects and resounding after effects of colonial rule, and the experience of racism. His characters, though, are lively, simple, everyday folk, but they are engulfed in a history much larger than themselves, and they are struggling under imperialism or exile. So this is a map. I wanted to share with you sort of a cartography of the area that Abdulrazak Gurna grew up in, because it's very significant to his writing. So here's Tanzania, and close in there is the island of Zanzibar. Now that island was a post, a trading post for all of these countries. All here were sharing with Zanzibar, and then materials were being transported into the interior of Africa to different nations. This vast trading area led to a very cosmopolitan society where people had migrated from India, from Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. So it became diverse in terms of the languages spoken, in terms of the cultures represented. And it was a very multicultural, cosmopolitan environment for him to grow up in until 1964 with the revolution, when all of that closed down, and which eventually led him to leave. Many languages are spoken in Tanzania or in Zanzibar. Kiswahili is the local language, but residents also speak Arabic, English, Italian, French, and other languages. So scholars want to label Gurna as an African writer because of his birth in Zanzibar, as an Indian Ocean writer because of this large trade network that affected him, and also as a post-colonial English writer. And that's why I'm here, because that's what I study, post-colonial English writers, and why I was invited to do this. That said, he does not readily embrace these labels, as his fiction thinks carefully about the ways such terms construct and impose identities. So I'm going to talk about two of his novels just briefly, because being a novelist is to be textual. I want to share with you some of his language and some of the ways in which he uses language to convey meaning. So recognizing his genius means also recognizing his questioning of all power relations and systems of oppression, such as gender oppression, racism. And in his protagonist story, his protagonist case in the novel Paradise, which was nominated for the Booker Prize, his erasure as a free subject when his father sells him as a Rahani to an Uncle Aziz. We never really know if Uncle Aziz is actually his uncle or whether it's more of an honorific used to recognize his place in the family. And he is sold as the surety on a mortgage his father must repay before Yusuf is freed from the debt. His father cannot repay and never does repay. The intertextual reference in this story is that of Yusuf and Joseph in the biblical and Quranic texts, who was sold into slavery by his brothers. So eventually we come to understand Yusuf's predicament. He can remain in domestic slavery, or he can choose colonial subjection to the incoming German army as an askari or a local recruit. He decides he would go somewhere where he could escape the oppressive claims everything made on him. But he knew that a hard lump of loneliness had long ago formed in his displaced heart, that wherever he went, it would be with him to diminish and disperse any plot he could hatch for small fulfillment. Gurna asks us to question all kinds of assumptions regarding power relations and how Yusuf must choose between two types of subjugation. The other novel I want to talk about is is not his most recent, but it is one that I believe speaks profoundly to current global realities of migration and displacement. It explores the experience of Saleh Omar, a Tanzanian refugee. Now, he's 65 years of age when he goes to England, and it considers his reception as he lands there. He lands at the airport and he's taken aside by an immigration official who will decide whether he has the right to stay or not, right on the spot. And Saleh says, refugee, pointing at my chest, asylum. And Gurna writes, these are not simple words, even if the habit of hearing makes them seem so. Saleh was told earlier when he was still in Zanzibar that without English, you are even more a stranger, a refugee. You're more convincing. You're just a condition without even a story. So though he can speak English, he insists on not letting the immigration officer know that. So the immigration officer's dependence on certain forms of identification, refugee or non-refugee, is thwarted. It's interrupted by Saleh's refusal to speak English. His silence interrupts the opposition between the powerful and the powerless. This interruption is one of Gurna's key techniques, an inverted mimicry, if you will, that exposes the realities of state power and the possibilities of subversion. Writing, says Gurna, has to show what can be otherwise, what it is that the hard, domineering eye cannot see. And this is why he has won the Nobel Prize. This is but one example of how great literature like Abdulrazak Gurna's challenges categories that define insider and outsider and ask us to think otherwise about bodies, which bodies are permitted to matter. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Jen.
Thank you for, I guess, identifying the importance of our roots and how awareness of self creates a rich, and I think in this case, a rich literature to empower others. So thank you. We're going to move on to our last and final presenter tonight. Dr. Ross Hickey is an associate professor of economics with the Faculty of Management and Irving K. Barber Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And Ross, thank you, a fourth-time presenter here at this event and for this prize. So Dr. Hickey tonight will be speaking about this year's, not the other three, but this year's Swej Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of he himself, Alfred Nobel. The 2021 prize was divided, one half awarded to David Card for his empirical contributions to labor economics, and the other half jointly to Joshua D. Angris and Guido W. Mbens for their methodological contributions to the analysis of causal relationships. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Ross. Thank you.
Thank you. But I decided to start with where I think the beginning of this award came from, which is models, something that economists like to talk a lot about, our economic models. And so this award was given to three economists who are self-described labor economists who don't work very much with models at all. In fact, what they do is try to help us economists refocus our attention on answering questions that are of importance to people who are interested in the economy using transparent, replicable, and credible methods. In fact, if you were to speak with the winners this year, they would say that they were inspired by the practices of researchers in medical fields. If you look at a medical journal, and in fact, David Card, one of the winners, said that he and Alan Kruger, a co-author, were inspired by looking at the New England Journal of Medicine and seeing that on the first page of these journal publications, there was a statement of the research design. Okay, and that's what these three winners all took very seriously, was the idea of creating and introducing research design, empirical research designs into economics. And the reason that that was important is because when in our past way of describing how the economy responds to different policies, we relied on these models that were not very transparent. And we were doing research in economics that was not very replicable. And that led us to be not very credible. In fact, in the 1980s, an economist from UCLA, Ed Leamer, wrote a paper that was widely cited called Taking the Con Out of Econometrics, in which he claimed that most economists do not trust the empirical work of other economists. And so Card, Kruger, Imbens, and Angrist took great steps to try to raise the bar of credibility, transparency, and replicability in our empirical work. And so to try to illustrate this for us, I'm going to do something that I think is now hard, given the previous presentations. Ask the economist, the dismal scientist, in a bare room to add some levity with some economics, but I'll do my best here. So, like I said, go back to the 1970s and think about minimum wages. How would economists do that? Well, we'd write down a model, much like I'm showing here. We'd have a demand for labor. Employers are looking for workers, and there's a supply of labor. Workers are looking for employers. And there would be a wage in equilibrium, that's that E in the middle, that would tell us at that wage an equilibrium amount of labor that would be provided, that would be exchanged in the labor market. Now, if we were to introduce a minimum wage into this environment, this theoretical environment, that would be placing a wage above the equilibrium wage. So the wage in equilibrium here is $10. If we were to put in a minimum wage of $12, what we would get is an excess supply of workers, the surplus of workers. These would be workers that would want to work, but would not be employed, because at a wage of $12 per hour in this environment that we're describing, only 700 workers are being demanded by employers. And so this analysis led economists to the prediction that minimum wages would decrease employment. Now, minimum wages are a hotly debated policy issue. And if you asked economists, most of them would have told you this is how we should think about the effect of a minimum wage. What Card and Kruger decided to do, one of the Nobel Prize winners, David Card, was they decided, well, let's look at minimum wage earners and see what happens to minimum wage earners and minimum wage firms that employ a lot of minimum wage earners in the face of an actual change in the minimum wage. Now, if we could behave like medical researchers, we could do a randomized controlled trial where we would have some firms that were employing low-skilled workers, allow them to pay them below a minimum wage, and other firms that were employing low-skilled workers impose upon them that they have to pay a higher minimum wage, and then test the results on how much employment would take place in both of those firms. And we actually do this at a scaled up version where we'd have many of these firms. Of course, we find that repugnant. The idea that social scientists would kind of roll dice with people's livelihoods is something that we don't find very appealing. So what these researchers did, Card and Kruger in particular, was they decided to look at a natural experiment. And as one of the prize winners, Guido Imbens, his daughter described why he won the Nobel Prize. It was for trying to do experiments without really doing experiments. And so what happened was that Card and Kruger noticed that the state of New Jersey in the United States was introducing a minimum wage that was above the federal minimum wage back in 1992, while Pennsylvania, the state adjacent to it, was not introducing a minimum wage. Its minimum wage was staying at the federal minimum wage of $3.80. So these researchers decided to do this natural experiment where they looked at what happens when we have minimum wage employing restaurants, these fast food restaurants in New Jersey and fast food restaurants in Pennsylvania, who are both employing the same types of workers. One of those restaurants is on one side of the border in New Jersey, and they're going to have to now face this new higher minimum wage. The other restaurants are on the other side of the border in Pennsylvania, and they won't. And so let's compare what happens with employment amongst these firms, fast food restaurants that employ minimum wage earning workers. And what they did was they did a pre-survey. They actually surveyed these restaurants before the minimum wage went into effect. That's that first vertical bar in February of 1992. The minimum wage went into effect in April of 1992. And then they did another post-survey of these restaurants in November of 1992. And what they found was that, if anything, in fact, New Jersey, the state that had been subjected to a higher minimum wage, had an increase in employment relative to Pennsylvania, where the minimum wage was not increased. Now, what I'm showing you here is in a reply that came some 6 years after the original publication of Card & Kruger's work. And this speaks to why they won the award. It wasn't just for the natural experiment. It's because of what natural experiments have done to the profession. They've made research transparent, credible, and replicable. Once they published this paper saying all of your theories are wrong, minimum wages don't increase unemployment, many people wrote responses saying, no, Card & Kruger, you guys have got it all wrong. And many people looked into the data and were trying to figure out what was going on. There were many replication exercises of the original study and further studies that have been done in response to that. Card & Kruger themselves then replied in around 2000, which is where this figure comes from, showing further that their research methods were appropriate, and that also, if we look at what happened later in amongst those restaurants in Pennsylvania, once the federal minimum wage was increased subsequently in 1996, they then got a boost in their employment. So if anything, minimum wages lead to an increase in employment. Something that our UBC researcher in Vancouver, Thomas Lemieux and Nicole Fortin, along with John DiNardo, discovered back in the mid-90s as well, is that oftentimes when minimum wages go up, firms tend to raise the wages of other workers, and that can have this effect of having an increase in demand for workers. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Alan Kruger was one of the researchers that took part in that particular study that I focused on. He also co-authored with Guido Imbens and Josh Angrist on their work. Unfortunately, Alan Kruger died on March 16th, 2019. So he's not able to receive the award. All of the award recipients, though, having been a collaborator of his, have mentioned that there's no doubt that he would also have been deserving of the prize had the Nobel Committee been willing to award it to someone posthumously. But to think about where Angrist and Imbens come in here, and I'll just to wrap it up, because I don't want to be late, because that's what Imbens and Angrist really got their award for, was for the discovery of what we call in economics LATE, which is the local average treatment effect. We don't really like acronyms that much, but we love that one, right? The local average treatment effect is where we're actually getting the effect of some policy on some outcome, okay? If we think about the research design like this, where there are some restaurants on one side of the border who are treated with a minimum wage, other restaurants on the other side of the border who are not treated with the minimum wage, we have 4 different kinds of restaurants, right? Some restaurants were going to raise wages anyway without the minimum wage. Some restaurants were never going to raise wages, okay? Some restaurants are going to raise wages only because the minimum wage kicks in, and those are what we call the compliers. And then there's some other restaurants that are going to be really funny. They're defiers. They're the ones in Pennsylvania that raised their wage because it didn't go up, but that seems kind of crazy. Imbens and Angrist did some painstaking statistical mathematical work to demonstrate how we can calculate these local average treatment effects and what the differences are between the treatment effects that we identify in the data and where it's coming from when we can isolate the local average treatment effect, which is coming from the compliers, those restaurants that change their behavior in response to the policy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hickey. We're now going to move on to recognizing the Physics Prize and the laureates. So the Nobel Prize in Physics for 2021 was awarded for groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of complex systems, with 1/2 jointly to Shukuro Manabe and Klaus Hasselmann for the physical modeling of the Earth's climate, quantifying variability, and reliably predicting global warming. That's a lot. And the other half to Giorgi Parisi for the discovery of the interplay of disorder and fluctuations in physical systems from atomic to planetary scales. Now, tonight, in the interest of time, we will not be presenting a talk on this prize, but you can find more information and details on this award at nobelprize.org. Now that brings us to the end of our formal presentations. I want to start by giving a big thank you to our presenters tonight. As we move into the question and answer period, they will be appearing on the screen and we'll be addressing the questions that have been posed in the chat by our audience. Now, our presenters put a great deal of time and effort into preparing for Nobel Night, and this event could not happen without them, and I thank them for their contributions. The other group I want to recognize is all the individuals behind the scenes that enable this and all of our other UBCO events to occur. And that's those individuals in media relations. So thank you very much for your time and your efforts in promoting all that we do at UBCO. So I'd like to invite all of our presenters to turn on their cameras and join us once again as we move to the Q&A portion of the evening. We are going to do our best to answer as many questions as possible. We'll focus on the most popular questions as they've been liked in the time remaining, and we'll do our best to get to all of these wonderful questions that I'm seeing. So what we're going to do moving forward is I'm going to do my best to address the individuals with the questions, and then please do your best to keep your answers as tight as possible, addressing the questions so we can then move on to the next one. So Dr. Oyaday, would chemical mediators of pain be effective with phantom pain, or is it completely different receptor mechanisms?
Thanks, Jen, and thank you for to the person who asked that question. The answer is yes and no, in the sense that this current research that these same proprioceptors, or actually the same nociceptors, the ones that respond to pain, can be blocked, and even currently there are treatments for blocking some of these nociceptors and managing the pain. And for example, the opioid drugs, that's one of the mechanisms that they use, so that they go to block the pain, not from where the pain is felt, right on the surface of the skin. And so the problem with phantom limb, like the questioner asked, is that when people have undergone amputation, some of those nerves are damaged, because you actually have you've cut the limb, and so you've cut the nerve and where it is, and so the nerve develops like a pathological response to pain. All right, so the threshold for pain becomes unbearable. Very, very small stimuli cause a lot of pain. And so rather than treat pain at the level of the receptor on the nerve, the pain is treated at more central levels, where we say central, so that at the level of the spinal cord or at the level of the brain. And that's where those opioid receptors opioid drugs come in. And so currently some of those are useful, but it's limited. And so there's intense research ongoing, because as I speak, more and more new receptors are being discovered. And so that even at the level of a particular type of treatment that is being envisaged is at the level of molecular level, genetic level, finding the genes that are actually responsible for those particular receptors and being able to block them more directly. So, but this is, as you know, to take research from bench level to product, I mean, that's at least 10 years. So this is something that is ongoing, but it's not, the outcome may not be as close as we would like. I hope I have been able to help answer a little bit of that. Yes.
No, and it's very interesting from the level of an individual who's experienced amputation to lose a limb or part there of a limb, and the treatment for the pain of that non-existing limb lives within the spinal cord or the central nervous system based upon these genes and the molecular mechanisms you've described. So thank you very much for sharing that answer with us and for the question. We're going to move on to the next question, and I will address this one to Mr. Walker. Sorry, as the questions come in, my screen moves. So let me just find the question. I know I was going to Mr. Walker. So Chris, any suggestions on how we can protect freedom of speech and expression and the safety of journalists?
Yeah, I mean, subscribe to local news, to news organizations. Pay for your news is basically what I'm saying. Now, one of the big problems right now is what they call local news deserts, where there are great, and we're suffering some of this in the interior of British Columbia right now, where there are great gaps in local news coverage, because that's where trust and accountability really begin, is with local news. So subscribe to news organizations, local if you can. Share only reputable information online and push back against misinformation. Now, I know that's hard. We can't always piss off all of our friends and family when we're saying, look, this isn't true. But I'm learning the hard way that there is a way to do this. There is a gentle and productive way to do this. You're not trying to convince the person who's posting the misinformation. You're trying to convince everybody else whose eyeballs are on it. Dr. Timothy Caulfield at the University of Alberta has done some really good work on this. So that's the second one. And then from this little book by a colleague of Maria Reza's at Yale University, by Timothy Snyder, called On Tyranny, chapter 8, if you want to call it a chapter, which is practice professional ethics in your own field. Which is to say, if you uphold professional ethics in your own field, you're helping to uphold professional ethics in journalism. And professional ethics in journalism are the backbone. I mean, I know to some that's an oxymoron, but the CBC has a long and exhaustive guideline of ethics on how we conduct ourselves, and all major news organizations do. And that's up to me to uphold. But if you uphold your professional ethics in your own field, you're helping to reinforce the institutional trust that is the backbone of a civic society. And that helps journalism.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's really important. Knowledge, accurate knowledge, and trust. So thank you. I am watching time here. We have so many questions. I don't know how many of these wonderful questions we're going to be able to get through, but we'll do our best. I'm going to pose the next question to Dr. Hickey. Do you feel the economic assumptions need to be updated, since it assumes that all investors are rational, which does not seem to be the case nowadays on numerous occasions? Pardon my laughter as I'm reading the question. Yes, rational is what we're talking about in this particular question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. So yeah, I mean, yes, I do think that our assumptions that we use to explain human behavior have to be updated, to the extent that that's what we're trying to do. A lot of what we do, it's unfortunate. At the university, I ask my students, you know, how many of you want to get a job after you finish your degree? And they almost all put their hands up. And I say, wouldn't you rather be capital instead of labor? Wouldn't you rather be an employer? You know, but really, people do want to get trained to be a worker. And the kind of jobs that people get in economics tend to be bank related. And when it comes to how banks behave and insurance companies and financial institutions, they very much are rational. So we teach them this kind of rational actor model because it's the best way to explain the context in which a lot of people find employment after economics training. But when it comes to the research that's being done, trying to explain human behavior, we've departed from that assumption a long time ago. So Kahneman and Tversky won a Nobel Prize in economics in the 90s for their prospect theory and other behavioral economics assumptions that they introduced. Richard Thaler got an award, I think, maybe 4 or 5 years ago for his contributions to behavioral economics. So as a discipline, as a field, the research we do to try to inform policy departs from the assumption of rationality. But as an educational entity, it's true, because students want to get jobs working for banks and insurance companies, we still teach them how rational investors operate.
Thank you, Ross. All right, we're going to move over to Dr. Mcneill. Are there other advantages besides the difference in price for metals versus organic catalysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are. I briefly alluded to some of them. Those metals that you find in those catalysts, they can often be toxic at pretty low levels. 1 part per million rhodium in your polymer that sits under the hood of your car maybe isn't that big a deal, but 1 part per million rhodium in the drug that you're taking is probably going to kill you. There are a lot of additional steps that we need to undertake to make sure that we're getting those catalysts out of the materials that we make of them after the fact. That's less of a concern with organic catalysts. The real power of this, I think, ultimately is moving the entire industry to a place that is more sustainable and greener, so that the tools that we're using to do the reactions that we want have less of an environmental impact, require less energy, are less problematic in terms of just where and how we get those materials. Those metals and those catalysts, they have to come from somewhere. They come out of a mine. They usually come out of a mine in a country that doesn't have a great environmental track record. If we can synthesize the catalysts out of less problematic materials, or materials that everybody has available, there are downstream effects in terms of the impacts of the industry as a whole. And so moving to more sustainable and more readily available materials at every step in a chemical process ultimately has benefits that go just far beyond the price, although the price of the catalyst affects the price of the drug, and somebody's paying for that price of the drug. So that's not a small consideration either.
Thank you, Stephen. Dr. Gustar, in what ways do you think Gurna's writings differ from his African, Indian Ocean, and post-colonial English contemporaries, or even past Nobel Prize winners in these genres?
Oh, that's a challenging question. I would say a couple things. I mean, a lot of people thought that Ngugi wa Thiong'o would win this time, and certainly he's deserving of a win. And there are other writers from the African continent that surely deserve this kind of recognition. As I said before, there have been very few Nobel Prizes awarded in literature to Africans. I suppose what I'd say about Gurna and its is that his work is widely applauded by many of the authors in Africa who we would have expected to have won. And the two things that I think, the way in which he differs, not from Ngugi or Wole Solanke, but from the way he differs, I think, is in his craft. His craft is so incredibly precise and so insightful. At the same time, I want to make this really clear, at the same time as he tells us such a compelling and approachable story. So he's able to bring together both that aesthetic craft, that kind of the intellectual and intriguing element of literary work, with this storytelling that just is just compelling. It's just captivating. And I would say, I can't say if that's different, but I would say that really is something that marks him out as special.
I would agree. Thank you for sharing, Jennifer. This is the hard part. Well, there's lots of hard parts of Zoom, but the hardest part of Zoom is that we can't gather afterwards so that we can continue to share information and address the questions. So we'll do our best to find a way to somehow address the questions and post them through some UBCO website. And I recognize that Ross has also identified that he'll be happy to post his comments or address further questions through email. and that he also indicates that there is a great video available with humor in the middle, which is always light and wonderful this time in our Zoom little worlds. So with that being said, I want to say thank you. Thank you to our speakers this evening. Thank you for representing these awardees amazingly well and sharing their work and their great accomplishments with us. It really helped us understand more. To our audience, thank you once again for joining us tonight. We look forward to welcoming you back on the Okanagan campus for both this event in the future and many other community events. With that being said, I wish you all a great evening. And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I'm going to go there. Happy New Year. Enjoy the holidays all. Take care.
Happy holidays.
UBC and our faculty, thank you.